So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar from the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment. For those of you joining our webinars for the very first time, the Smith School is based in Oxford's School of Geography and the Environment, and we have a vision, which is a net zero emissions future supported by a sustainable global economic and financial system. And our research that's structured across 4 disciplines and 6 cross-cutting thematic areas is geared towards achieving this mission. Over the past year, we've published extensively on the imperative and pathways to move rapidly to a net zero world. But needless to say, COP is one of the highlights of our year, and a number of our researchers and our academics attended this year and have been following COP. So here to discuss whether COP27 delivered or where it may have fallen short are 4 of the school's experts, including, I'd say, some COP veterans. So let me take a couple of minutes to introduce them. And if we've taken the holding slide down, I'll start off by introducing first Professor Cameron Hepburn, who's director of the Smith School and professor of environmental economics at the University of Oxford, and also director of the Economics of Sustainability program at INET in the Oxford Martin School. Then we've got Dr. Steve Smith, who's at the Smith School and executive director of 2 programs led by Oxford, the Oxford Net Zero Initiative and CO2RE, which is the Greenhouse Gas Removal Hub. And Steve's research interests lie at the intersection of climate science and policy, and he is also co-developer of a major global stocktake of net zero pledges, which I'm sure we'll hear about today. Next, we've got Dr. Sugandha Srivastav, who is a postdoctoral research associate in the Climate Compatible Growth Program at the Smith School. Sugandha's research focuses on designing effective climate policy in low and middle income countries, and she also explores incentives for clean innovation and the political economy of energy transitions. And last but not least, joining us directly from COP27 is Alexis McGivern, who is Net Zero Standards Manager at Oxford Net Zero, working to translate academic research on net zero into actionable insights for the business sector. And Alexis also works to strengthen the standards landscape to improve the integrity of net zero, including through addressing justice and equity concerns of net zero. We were meant to have Dr. Jessica Omukuti from the Oxford Net Zero Initiative also scheduled to join us, but she's not been able to due to unforeseen changes. So before we get into the discussion, because we've had some questions submitted beforehand, and I'm sure there will be many more, I'd like to encourage all of our attendees to basically use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to send in your questions or make your comments, and we'll pose them to all of our panelists. So I'd like to start off perhaps with a clutch of questions, overarching questions, and perhaps I can come to you with my first one, Cameron. So there's been a lot of discussion about whether the 1.5 degree target has been kept alive at COP27. Barring any announcements in the next few days, because COP's not over yet, what's your perspective on that?
It certainly isn't over, and I see Alexis is right in there, still in the thick of things, while I'm happily back here in Oxford with my lovely children. So yeah, will we keep 1.5 alive? Well, I think it was a hard ask last year in a sense, and look, for me, a lot of the action isn't necessarily in the specific words of the text. A lot of the action here has been around loss and damage, which I guess is a tacit admission that we're not on track. We clearly haven't been on track. I was clearing out my office the other day and found a paper I'd written about COP6, not 26, and it's been too long with fine words and not a lot of action. So. Without saying the COP has been a failure, which I'm not saying, I think the things to look at are how much progress have we made on questions like bring down the costs of clean technology on the harder to abate sectors. Obviously, we're winning on wind and solar, and those wins continue, notwithstanding the value chain disruptions from COVID and from the war. We need more at these COPs on carbon dioxide removal, in my view. It's good to have Steve with us today. We probably need more on methane, we were just talking about earlier, if we're going to reduce or keep temperatures down in the short term. So there's a lot remains to be done for next year in the UAE, and a lot remains to be done by governments and business leaders around the world, because it's not as if we come together once a year and try and think about this problem, month by month, day by day. emissions continue and temperatures get higher. So it's been a useful marker, I would say. I know it's not done yet, but as Claire Perry, one of the Smith School Business Fellows, likes to say, really, these meetings are about how much action you can get to happen on the ground, in a sense, on the side of the negotiations.
Thanks, Cameron. There are a lot of things to dig into there, and we'll come to loss and damage as well in a moment in greater detail. But I just wanted to go to Steve next and sort of tweak that question a little bit. So Steve, given that we had the publication of the Global Carbon Budget Report last week as well, do you think that this COP could lead to some sort of renewed emphasis on carbon removals, for instance? What's your view on that?
Well, the Global Carbon Project results, as you say, came out and showed that global emissions of CO2 remain high and are about the level of the previous record just a few years ago, pre-COVID. So I think the key message from the Global Carbon Project is really about emissions rather than removals. Emissions are far too high. We know that in order to stop the rising global temperatures, we have to get global CO2 emissions all the way down to net zero. So we need to come to a full stop in emissions. And the Global Carbon Project data shows essentially we've taken our foot off the accelerator. Emissions aren't rising or haven't been for the last few years, but we're still at top speed, right? And we're racing right towards that 1.5 degree limit. So I think we have to be totally upfront that the main problem here is our rampant emissions, which we may have flatlined for the last few years, but we haven't turned down, and we have to do that. But it is true to say that as well as that emissions cut we need to see, carbon removal has a role to play. So it's essentially in all the pathways of the likes put forward in scientific assessments like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to achieve the Paris Agreement. Carbon removal is in there alongside emissions reduction. And actually the text of the Paris Agreement says that the headline goal in order to achieve, well below 2 and aim for 1.5 is achieving a balance of sources and sinks. So the Paris Agreement really made carbon removal go mainstream. And by carbon removal, of course, we're talking about a whole range of different things. This isn't one thing. So it's about protecting and enhancing our natural habitats and our ecosystems, which can do a lot of work for us. But it's also about developing new technologies which can actually capture CO2 in various ways. Maybe even using our forests, so using more wood in construction or using more technological measures and storing potentially underground in geological formations as well. Now, interestingly, carbon removal has actually emerged in the draft headline text we've seen this morning. There's a call, and it is only draft, of course, that developed nations need to actually achieve net negative emissions by 2030. We'll see if that stays in. But I think the recognition that we're careening towards this climate target and emissions aren't coming down, and the issues of fairness involved in the fact that developed countries have not yet done enough themselves, means that carbon removal is emerging in the conversations around fairness, I think, and what is kind of owed to the world. What we see a lot less of in the negotiations is how we actually deliver that. So how are we going to generate these new technologies, bring them down to be cost effective and genuinely effective in taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere. So I think that's a gap at the moment.
Thanks, Steve. And that's quite relevant about how it's phrased in the text and whether the weight of that pertains mainly to the developed world or the developing world. And perhaps, Sugandha, I can come to you with kind of a related question next. Last year, COP26, in the words of Boris Johnson's COP advisors last year, COP was all about cash, coal, cars, and trees. One would say this year, it's about probably coal a lot more. But one interesting thing that we've seen is India's position and the fact that last year, India was one of the countries that pushed for that change in the text. And this year, it's maybe surprised a lot of countries by insisting that oil and gas be given the same attention as coal when it comes to phase downs. So what's your perspective on what that means around getting draft agreements in place, and what does it mean for the 1.5 degree target?
Sure. So just to contextualize that, for India, equity has always been the centerpiece of climate negotiations. And typically what we've seen is the principle of common but differentiated responsibility has led India to sort of, dilute or try to dilute these various commitments. But now, for the first time, we've seen equity actually resulting in a ramp up of ambition And on equity grounds, India feels coal is distributed in a lot of important global South nations, like it's indigenous to India, it's indigenous to Turkey, whereas oil and gas is also indigenous to OECD nations and rich countries. So, you know, on equity grounds, it should be a phase down of all fossil fuels, also on scientific grounds. Now, I think something like that is encouraging to see equity be the driver of a ramp up of ambitions. And I also think, Anupama, even though that brings challenges in garnering more agreement, there have been encouraging developments with the US and the European Union coming behind that sort of commitment to include all fossil fuels, with pushback from Saudi Arabia. So I think, you know, it is high time that it's suddenly on the agenda. We always knew that we had to include all fossil fuels. And I think it's good to see that shift in equity driving a ramp up of climate ambition.
Thanks, Sugandha. And maybe I could come to you next, Alexis. Hopefully you're able to hear us over all the noise of negotiations going on in the background. But you mentioned, when we were speaking earlier, you mentioned that there'd been a tweak to the draft text around 1.5 degrees. So is that relevant, do you think? And a lot of this, of course, if I could follow up on that, depends on sort of an agreement around frameworks to harmonize global action on cutting greenhouse gas emissions. And that's something that you've been very deeply involved in at COP as well. So do you see the two things as being related or taking place parallelly? And how do you see the 1.5 degrees sort of agreement relating to the nitty-gritty of harmonization of frameworks?
Sure, thanks so much. So yeah, as I said, we're crouched on a bunch of boxes near the negotiation room, so coming at you, very scrappy. But yeah, I guess the main thing that I wanted to emphasize is that these processes are done with very subtle tweaks in language, but these are, you know, the people within the climate justice community particularly are very well attuned to those small changes. So the new text on the global goal that came out yesterday changed some text on 2 degrees, saying categorizing previously 2 degrees as catastrophic, and now it's been kind of downscaled a little bit to increasingly severe climate impacts at 2 degrees. And I think the concern that's coming up from the climate justice community here that we've been liaising with a lot is just that kind of a backing away from 1.5 or minimizing the impacts, the catastrophic level of impacts that we'd see at 2 degrees is very concerning, given that at this level we've seen lots of delegates come from all over the world to demand justice for their communities and to say that this level of warming is completely unsustainable. There's been a lot of discussion as well within this space is about what they're calling false solutions. There's been a lot of discussion about CCS, and not CCS in the way that it's been used to, as we were discussing earlier about hard to abate emissions. We're talking really about using greenhouse gas removal or CCS to legitimize the expansion of new fossil fuel extraction. And especially there's been a lot of discussion about the role that African gas will play in this landscape. We have kind of a tension over narrative here, especially that the narrative that's being pushed is that African gas should be used as a transition fuel, that is essential for development, and that it's important as a human rights basis. And then we have also organizers within the African climate justice space saying actually that gas is going to be exported and going to Europe and North America, and so that this narrative has been really co-opted to say, yes, let's do new fossil fuel expansion and allow it to not even contribute to development goals. So I guess, yeah, there's just been an interesting tension here between narratives. There's a real battle for narratives, especially around African fossil fuel expansion, and a lot of desperation to stick to 1.5. And also, as we've already discussed, there's been so much tension here around loss and damage. You can see it every day. There's people walking around dressed in blue that just say loss and damage now, pay up now. So it's been increasingly kind of pressure cooker around loss and damage.
That's really interesting, Alexis. And Cameron, maybe I could come to you next and kind of stay on that theme of loss and damage, and also sort of look at this issue of fossil fuels and clean energy in the transition, because that's something that's driving this. So sort of kind of in contrast to this narrative around loss and damage, we've seen a lot of new clean tech initiatives and proposals being launched at COP27, like the Breakthrough Energy Agenda, the First Movers Initiative, and so on. And I know that you and other researchers at the Smith School have written and published about transitioning to a decarbonized energy system and the fact that it can be cheaper, it can raise GDP, and in a sense, it's almost like a silver bullet. So what do you think is being lost here in that narrative? And do you think that these initiatives can actually drive agreements in other areas of the negotiations?
Yeah, thanks, Anupama. I mean, obviously, the best way of reducing loss and damage is to transition as fast as possible, which is not to say there aren't impacts. There are, and nor is it to say that there shouldn't be some sensible mechanisms for providing compensation for that loss and damage. But our work here has instead been mainly focused on, well, let's prevent rather than, it's not even cure, it's kind of compensate, and on the prevention side, we did see the breakthrough agenda agreed at COP26. I thought that was probably the most significant piece of the COP that was largely ignored, or not quite ignored, but the press didn't seem that interested in it. And yet actually saying, okay, here are a set of half dozen nearly tech areas where if we can get the cost of clean energy down so that it is the cheapest in all countries and the most reliable in all countries by 2030, then you don't have these conversations about whether it's equitable or not to use gas as a transition fuel. Gas is just, it's whipped by a zero carbon alternative. And so the politics disappears, the kind of gas as an equitable transition fuel, that disappears. So, just actually beat the dirty technologies with the clean technologies. So I mean, the clean power is one of the breakthroughs. There's road transport breakthrough, there's a hydrogen breakthrough, there's one on agriculture and so on. So I think those sorts of efforts really matter. And one of the nice things about this COP for me was seeing the huddles and the business people, not just the business leaders actually, but the people who actually delegated the work streams to get on and think about how we're going to do this, actually getting together and working on how we're going to do this, whether it's on the cement industry. I spent a bit of time in one of their sessions. It's got a long way to go, obviously, but this is the sort of action that we need. And a year or so ago, I was saying I personally was getting fairly sick of grand speeches, grand promises, grand ambitions that are not met, and having a COP every other year that's just focused on getting the job done seems to me to be a better way of going about things.
Yes, so Cameron, you should be in those COP negotiations, I feel. But anyway, some really interesting material there. And just a kind of quick reminder to our audience to send in your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. But Sugandha, if I could come to you on what Cameron just said, and on this issue of clean energy, and in some ways it's a no-brainer. Another sort of key COP27 announcement that we saw was John Kerry's Energy Transition Accelerator. And here there was sort of this bid to finance the decommissioning of coal and accelerate energy deployment in developing countries. Do you think those sorts of things make any sort of material differences to the challenges or to the growth challenges being faced in developing countries?
I know Alexis also has a lot to say on this, but let me give my take first. The high level picture of supporting clean technology and financing it is, as Cameron said, absolutely essential. This can dissipate a lot of the political conflict, and it can also create green tech clusters that prevent policy backsliding. But coming to the specific energy transition, accelerator, I think, look, there's one part of it that's problematic, which is related to the carbon offsetting and ensuring that, any type of carbon offsetting mechanism needs credibility, verification, and a system of governance on a global level that probably doesn't exist yet. That's not to say it can't be done. I think we can have credible mechanisms to direct finance from the global north to the global south and fund emissions reductions We just need to be very clear about what that really requires to make it credible and to put in place the appropriate monitoring and verification infrastructure. So I think, we need to go into that with eyes wide open. We've tried things like this before where there hasn't been the right kind of verification processes to see, are the projects additional? Are they actually contributing to the required emissions reduction? But I think if I could step one, take it even further, the decommissioning coal element of this and payments to leave fossil fuels in the ground are an extremely important component of this. We've seen payments for early closures of coal mines in Germany. The Asian Development Bank has launched an energy transition mechanism to finance coal closures in Indonesia and the Philippines. And in fact, there's a proposal to also do this for the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is looking at exploring oil and gas fields in an area which is actually one of the most biodiverse ecosystems in the world. So, there is a need to think about decommissioning coal and paying to leave it in the ground. It's just a question of doing that in a way that is just and actually additional. And that's, I think, where we need the kind of monitoring infrastructure and governance infrastructure in place.
So this is a point on which I'd like to bring Alexis in as well. So, and we have a question from the audience as well on this, Alexis, which is what's your view of carbon offsetting initiatives, and what are the biggest challenges and failures of these initiatives? And perhaps you could give a perspective in relation to what Sugandha just said about the view that developing countries take and the challenges that they face with actually phasing down and moving away from fossil fuels to clean energy.
Yeah, sure. So thanks for the question. I think the concern that, sorry, there's lots of delegates in the hall. The concern that we saw this week with Kerry's announcement is just that kind of the opaque or concerning nature of his offsetting initiative. And I guess what the main concern that we have with offsetting is, as Sugandha mentioned, is additionality. Additionality and land tenure issues. So there's some great analysis that came out from Oxfam last year that kind of showed the tension between land use for carbon offsets versus land needed for food security. And that's kind of also been a major tension and debate that's been discussed here. The piece on land tenure is something that has been talked about a lot within the, as I mentioned, the climate justice community that we've been following a lot here, and the amount of land that would be needed to offset on land-based removals alone is 5 times the size of India, according to Oxfam's estimates, not to mention the issues of permanence. So that this kind of brings us back around to the discussion of greenhouse gas removal, more permanent removals, which Steve was mentioning earlier. But I guess the main concern there is, what that is used, not disagreeing that is baked into IPCC scenarios or that will be needed. It's more that the existence of that and what it's used to legitimize in terms of expansion. So, and if I have time a little bit later, I would love to come in on some of the things that have been discussed on adaptation, and especially mobilizing finance for adaptation, because there's been 2 pretty key developments there on adaptation and on loss and damage. If I'm right, Sugandha?
Yeah, thanks, Alexis. And perhaps, Steve, I could follow up with you on those points that Alexis made on land use and offsetting with regards to removals. Could you give us your perspective on that? And you might want to mention the high-level expert group as well.
Yes, I mean, having said that carbon removal will be vital, it's true also that there isn't infinite potential to do it. So we really need to get it right in scaling it up and hold both of those things kind of in tension. I think one of the other things that's been a big theme in COP27 is the discussion around the kind of net zero pledges that really proliferated, particularly in the run up to COP26. And whereas COP26 saw this huge wave of pledges, which was really quite encouraging from, countries, companies, states, cities, all levels of society. The discussion since then has been, well, how credible really are these pledges? Do we trust them to get to net zero? Is that really going to deliver what we need? And this is something actually that Oxford's been heavily involved in. So it's brilliant that, you know, Alexis and Kaya and colleagues have been involved in work with the International Standards Organization this year to come up with an appropriate definition and guidelines for net zero. Jessica's been involved through the high-level expert group on net zero credible claims. As you mentioned, Anupama, we're involved in the net zero tracker, actually tracking the pledges made by all these different entities. And so there have been legitimate concerns, I think, about net zero. And I think what we're seeing now is a move to sort of formalize and structuralize that much better, which is great and really important. I think what it's surfaced is very briefly kind of two broad concerns around net zero. One is what Cameron talked about is this just grand speeches about big ambitions that are never met? And the second one is the net, which is what Alexis has been talking about. So what is the role of offsetting in this? And what is the role of removals? And under what circumstances can you use those kind of wisely and sensibly? So I think I'm really pleased to see that kind of guidance has been, is being generated, and we're playing a key role in that. And I think actually it's surfacing a bunch of issues around, you know, how do you match short-term action and long-term ambition? How do you make sure that there's real transparency in these processes so people publish their plans, they can be interrogated, people understand what you're planning to do as an organization? What is the role of offset credits and removals? And actually those issues aren't just net zero specific. If we achieve a net zero world, that's going to involve a whole bunch of entities which will get to just zero, maybe a few who are above, and a few who go beyond to net negative, and maybe that's where we'll need to go globally beyond. So I think the issues that are being surfaced in these net zero guidelines actually go deeper and apply more widely to all sorts of climate targets by individual companies and countries and so on.
Thanks, Steve. And I'd like to sort of come to Cameron on a question that we have in the chat. But before that, could I quickly go to you, Alexis, first on what Steve just said about guidelines and frameworks. You've been very deeply involved in the ISO guidelines, the International Standards Organization guidelines. So what's the process for what happens next with those after they've been launched? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. So Kaya Axelson, who is the Net Zero Policy Engagement Fellow, is a technical author on those. And we were our team was very closely involved in getting that through. So it was an enormous process, 1,200 participants from 100 countries commonly agreeing to definitions of net zero and also what a gold standard of net zero strategy looks like. And actually it was interesting because normally very inclusive processes like that can dilute ambition, but this text is really strong and you can view it at our 2050 World. I'll put a link in the chat. But basically now what happens with those guidelines is two things. So there are 167 bodies that sit within the ISO, so national standards bodies. This was convened by the British Standards Institution, but the kind of next step is basically integrating that into the national standards bodies of all of the people who are member to ISO. Which is just really important because the idea between this and also the announcement that came out earlier this week, it's a shame Jessica couldn't make it, but she was sitting on the high-level expert group of the net zero commitments of non-state actors, very big mouthful, so we'll call it HLEG. The idea behind kind of just further boxing in what a gold standard of net zero strategy should look like and trying to avoid greenwash. And the second piece of this is also making sure that we either, there's a pathway to collaborate with existing standards on net zero, like the SBTI, or to embed it more importantly, to try to embed those principles into regulation. So we're trying to make sure that that document is really taken up by rulemakers, and so that the kind of gold standard on net zero doesn't just exist within the voluntary initiative or standards landscape, but is really embedded strongly into regulation.
Thanks, Alexis. And presumably that's going to be quite important for this issue of hard to abate sectors and how to basically get net zero credibly embedded into those as well. And sort of this brings me back to kind of the high level question that we've got in the chat, which I'd like to pose to you, Cameron, which is, are biannual COPs better than the annual show? Because there's all of this stuff happening on standards within industry, within sectors. And what actually then happens at COP? Is it just announcements or is it a platform for action?
Yeah, so I think, just to make sure I'm not misunderstood, I think it is very helpful that we get people together to make progress and to work on these issues. You could even make the case that annual is not frequent enough. But of course, these COPs are not the only way in which businesses, governments, etc., get together. We've got the G20, we've got the UN General Assembly, we've got Climate Week, we've got a bunch of other, dare I say, the Smith School World Forum as well. That's a bit more elite. So I don't think we should, cancel one in every 2 COPs, but I do think it's important that we don't kind of permit our political leaders just to make promises, and that we insist that they report globally on what's actually been achieved, and that we're holding people accountable. And I mean, I've just been incredibly proud, really, of just how much Oxford Smith School and Oxford people in general are working to hold our various leaders accountable. Because remember, if all of the net zero pledges that have been made, as Steve's been tracking, were delivered upon, we're in reasonably good shape. I mean, we're not at 1.5, but we are below 2. So actually simply requiring everybody to do what they've said they're going to do is half of the battle. And Kaya and Alexis and Jessica have been doing brilliant work in actually kind of getting into the guts of the economic system and changing these standards so it makes it more difficult for companies to make bad decisions. Brian O'Callaghan's out there working on the state and development financial side of things. Ben Caldecott with the public and actually private financial developments there is doing excellent work. I mean, this is where we're at now. It's about making sure business and government is actually doing what needs to be done to deliver net zero. And there's a sense in which we're still a very long way away from that. But so people say to me, I don't get how you're still optimistic, given that you're looking at the numbers, same numbers that I'm looking at, and I'm looking at them and thinking, well, 1.5 does look kind of virtually dead, if not already dead. And for me, it's that actually we think there'll be these nonlinear shifts in the way technology gets adopted. And I also think we'll see nonlinear shifts on the political landscape. So what Sugandha was just pointing to in terms of equity now pushing ambition, I don't think that'll be the last time this happens, as you have more and more countries being hit by floods like in Pakistan, or wildfires or droughts or the rest of it. As horrible as that is, it only ratchets up the insistence of people all around the world. It's like, it's not enough now. I mean, 27 years of prevarication, we can't go on like this, and we're not going to go on like this because the tech is changing and because the demands from citizens are changing too. So that's what feeds my optimism. Sorry for the long answer.
That was perfect, and it lifted the mood a little bit as well. So that's great. Thanks, Cameron. I'd like to come to you next, Sugandha, and perhaps sticking with this point, this brilliant point that Cameron made about business, governments, other institutions coming together, and equity pushing ambition. We've had a question in from the audience, which you might want to take, but also you might want to provide your general thoughts around this. And the question is, multilateral institutions like the World Bank, and you mentioned the Asian Development Bank as well in the beginning. What's their role in this, and are they the appropriate institutions to allocate climate change finance to countries like India and other countries that need it basically to drive the transition? So do you have a perspective on that?
Sure, we have a perspective and hopefully a project and a paper, which will be coming out soon, where we are working with these multinational banks, including the UK's BII, to conceptualize what net zero investment portfolios look like, and really thinking about, the World Bank and ADB, BII, they have massive portfolios. And if we can shift these portfolios to be compatible with net zero commitments, that already moves the needle in quite a meaningful way. It's just that there's a technical challenge associated with that. For example, a lot of the investments are multi-decadal infrastructure projects where you can't just bring them to net zero immediately. You might have to take on the project. That might mean the CO2 intensity of your portfolio increases in the short term as you sort of work to decarbonize that over the next sort of 10 years or so. So there's this idea of, taking on dirty and cleaning them up that's sort of part of the story. There's also kind of the idea of how you measure and do the carbon accounting properly. Many of these multilateral institutions, they finance other banks, which in turn finance a wide variety of projects. So, you know, it's kind of, you know, scope 3 emissions are anyway hard to measure. And here you kind of have intermediate, you know, intermediaries in the middle. So I think, you know, we are thinking about, there's kind of novel proposals of how to do carbon accounting and how to incentivize project developers to disclose emissions. So one idea is that you slap on an estimated emissions from a project, which is higher, you know, which is kind of higher than what the actual could be, but you use that as a conservative estimate. And that would then create an incentive for the project to actually measure its own emissions, because instead of being labeled as a big polluter, it would rather just measure its own emissions and disclose that. So it creates this automatic unraveling mechanism. There's a lot of novel ideas out there. So I think the multilateral space can do a lot in terms of shaping up their own investment portfolios to be net zero compatible. But we can also improve carbon accounting in the process. And, you know, to keep up the note of optimism, we're seeing a lot of movement in this space. There are new job descriptions that were never there in LinkedIn before on how to actually measure this and the technical aspects of it. So for all those in the audience that are, you know, trying to find new jobs or interested, you know, the space is absolutely exploding.
Thanks, Sugandha. And perhaps I can come to you back to you just for a minute, Alexis, on that point, because you've sort of made the point that the ISO document was the most downloaded document ever in the history of ISOs. And presumably that will also serve as sort of a core reference almost, or a gold standard for maybe multilateral institutions that are looking to improve or looking for improved credibility on what they finance.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's great to see that this guidance, yeah, second most rather than most, but almost there. No, it is great to see this level of kind of engagement on the multilateral institutions. I mean, the big thing that's been coming up this week is the role of multilateral institutions in how they can. I mean, it's what's interesting about the ISO is that we're taking a very big, very old institution and trying to kind of push it towards climate action in its own way. So by, you know, revising these standards on the multilateral institution front, there's been a big discussion this week that Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, put forward, which is kind of a change to how the IMF would operate in order to allow for a lot more climate finance to be unlocked. So her Bridgetown initiative that she's been working on since Glasgow last year and has been gaining a lot of traction here is really about using the kind of building blocks of big institutions like the IMF and making it work. So making it work to deliver climate finance. So she has proposed having something, drawing on something called special drawing rights, which were used a lot during COVID, which is basically ways to unlock huge amounts of financing. And her call was for $650 billion annually to be released under that special drawing rights scheme because of the kind of continued lack of delivery of the $100 billion adaptation goal. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that these huge institutions that are known for being slow and maybe hard to push, and there's a lot of people who are innovating them from the inside or proposing innovations that would allow them to move a lot faster and be a lot leaner. So the Bridgetown Initiative is just one example, and ISO is another.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you for mentioning the Bridgetown Initiative, which is something that was also quite an important development at COP. I'd maybe like to sort of slightly change tack a little bit and come back to you, Steve, because we've had a question in the chat that's directly addressed to you, and also maybe relating it to the announcements that we've seen on the support for carbon markets and basically different technologies and incentivizing decarbonization. The question is, how do you choose the right technology for carbon removal, which you just mentioned? Like, how can you ensure that the right technologies are adopted to combat climate change from amongst PVs, batteries, CCS, etc.? I'm not sure there's an answer there, but it'd be good to get your perspective on this.
Sure. Well, we're not in a position to be terribly picky if we're serious about achieving the Paris Agreement. So I really would not like to get into a discussion about a trade-off between can we ignore batteries and go for carbon capture and storage, or go for planting more trees. All of the things that are, kind of on the table being discussed at the moment, we really need to pursue pretty much as fast as we can if we're serious about that. So that would be my kind of first point. But I think broadly, from my point of view, there are probably three ways that you can choose the right technology. Number one is, what are those things which really change the whole system and really open up your option space? Number two is, what are the things that we can back where the costs and the ease of doing things are really going to come down and become more affordable and just displace the dirty alternative? And number three is, what can we do that actually at least doesn't make the situation worse in terms of all the other things we're dealing with: biodiversity, social inequality, opportunities for people, human health, and so on, and ideally improve those. So number one, the kind of systems and option space. Great example is clean electricity through renewables, because not only do you clean up a major emitting sector in terms of power generation, but you can electrify other sectors. So you get these extra wins or these extra options in transport and heating and so on. I'd also say, working out how to capture CO2 back of the atmosphere not only gives you the option to balance out any residual emissions to stabilize the climate, but opens up the option of maybe clawing some back if you need to. So there's that kind of systemic, what are the systemic wins or opportunities? Where might the cost come down? What we've seen is technologies like wind and solar and batteries, they're modular, they're repeatable. You can make a batch, you can learn from your mistakes, you can go again, and you can go at bigger scale, and you can go at lower cost. So I think backing those kind of technologies which have those characteristics is going to be another way to pick right technologies and behaviors. And then the third thing is the bigger wins. So, not only do renewables cut out the carbon problem, but they radically improve air quality, very immediate human health problem for people around the world. If we improve our diets, we improve our own health, as well as gaining wins in terms of carbon and sustainability more broadly. So I think, systemic wins, things we can back, the costs and ease will come down, and things that give us broader benefits as well.
Thanks, Steve. And there was a question about air quality in the chat, which I'll come back to in a moment. But I just wanted to follow up with Cameron on your point around technologies and which technologies to choose, etc. So we had a question that was pre-submitted about how we should think about the risks to inflation from potentially higher cost energy in the future. Could I pose that to you, Cameron?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we obviously have a pretty massive inflation problem right now, not just in the future. And that inflation problem is in no small measure a result of energy system issues. I mean, it's easy to forget how important energy is to the modern economy because it's only kind of a small percentage of GDP, but actually all of the major step changes in prosperity have, or perhaps not all of them, but a lot of them have had changes in energy technology at the core of them. So we're obviously on the cusp of one now, and people naturally worry if we're going to be changing how we wire the economy and it's going to be different, could it be worse? But for those who worry, there's quite a lot of good news here. So first, what's driven the inflation related to energy right now? Well, it's not your clean technologies, it's your fossil fuel technologies, obviously. It's in particular, it's gas, but also oil, and to a lesser extent, coal. And the drivers are well understood, and then this is not unusual. We have these big cyclical spikes in energy prices. We have had not just for 20 or 30 years, but for as far as our data go back 140 years. There's no trend in a reduction in the cost of fossil fuels, but they do cycle up and down. And when they do cycle up, they cause misery, as we're seeing now. People have far less money to spend, and they're not just feeling a lot poorer, they are in fact a lot poorer. So, okay, so do we need to be worried about this clean transition causing more macroeconomic and indeed kind of concerns that a central bank should be looking into? As I said, there's some good news. I mean, the good news is that Steve just pointed to the mechanism, but we see these clean energy costs coming down. We've seen that for decades. It's very reliable. It's hard to get our heads around these exponential growth processes, but if you have cost declines in the order of 15% per annum, as we've had on solar, then over a decade, you're collapsing the cost. I can't do the maths in my head, but probably 80 to 90%, something like that, cost reduction. And so if you fast forward to 2050, when we're running our economies on much cheaper clean energy, then central banks don't have to worry about inflationary pressures. This is a source and a big driver of prosperity. It's a helpful deflationary driver in the macroeconomy. What I think central banks need to worry about more, actually, is the nonlinearities that work in our collective favor in relation to the transition to net zero are balanced by nonlinearities that are pretty nasty on the climate impacts side of the spectrum. And you only need a couple of major climate shocks in different parts of the world that take out bread baskets, a couple of them at the same time, and you've got not just a bit of food price inflation, you've got mass starvation, you've got a lot of migration, forced migration as well. So I think the central banking community is starting to get to grips with both the potential major upsides of a rapid transition and also some of the risks of climate impacts. But those nonlinearities, we still struggle to get them into the modeling community that's being done. You find these kind of very gradual, a bit of a hit to GDP, a few fraction of a percentage points here over a decade or two. And the world is just, it's never worked like that. It's not working like that now, and it's not going to work like that in the future. So we need to sort out the modeling. So that'd be one of my key takeaways for the central banking community from this call.
Great. It is one of those sort of systemic things, but it's also a sensitive intervention point, and essentially something where you make one change that you get this wonderful multiplier effect across other things. And perhaps you could.
Can I be really cheeky?
Go ahead.
And sorry, Anupama, to interrupt you, but
Jump
I think
in here.
We're talking about stranded assets. I think there are probably a few stranded intellectual assets too, in the form of models that probably need to be given a dignified death, in the same way that we need to give the fossil fuel industry a dignified death. Because let's remember, like the fossil fuel industry, these models have served us very well for a long time, and they're just not fit for purpose going into the future. Sorry to interrupt you.
I think that needed to be said, Cameron. So thank you for that. I wanted to sort of come to Sugandha next, because we've got a lot of questions coming in on the chat and the Q&A. And perhaps, Sugandha, I could pose this to you, which is about what Steve was touching upon, the co-benefits of clean tech with other things. So Cameron mentioned the co-benefits of clean tech with maybe fiscal security or going forward energy security. What about things like air quality? When you've been following COP, has there been any discussion about this, about co-benefits with things like air quality and other things?
Yeah, Anupama, for sure. I mean, all around with the civil society groups, particularly quite a few in India, have been very active about air quality. In fact, sometimes what I love to hear is something like, oh, did you know solar panels help reduce household bills, but they also reduce CO2 emissions? And I'm like, maybe the more we go to that sort of phrasing where you first and foremost put the co-benefit first is important. But coming to the case of India in particular, where we're seeing a lot of civil society movement and action, I can contextualize this a little bit. Delhi is one of the most populous cities in the world, with 12 million people living in Delhi proper, and the national capital region has 48 million people. It's located in a valley, and within a 300-kilometer radius, you have 11 to 13 coal-fired power plants, most of which aren't even meeting basic standards on sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides. And they've been given extensions until 2027 to meet basic air pollution standards. Now, this is a domestic problem. 1 in every 4 people in India's pollution control boards has been actually linked back to industry in some way. And in fact, the first air quality controls were introduced in 2015, but have been systematically delayed year by year. So what's going to happen is that we're going to walk away from COP, and regardless of the international negotiations, there's going to be a huge legal and domestic pressure to address this issue. I mean, we've been seeing that in the legal space where various NGO groups and all, air pollution has been escalated to the Supreme Court several times, and we're seeing this kind of escalation on the legal front. So I think what we can expect is kind of a ramping up of unilateral domestic action based on things like air pollution, which are kind of tangible, localized costs. And I think that what we'll also see is an increasing awareness of how clean energy technologies, not only reduce costs, but things like air pollution by pushing out dirty energy. So I think, Anupama, like this is a really interesting space because it kind of flips the logic of climate action. We've always historically academically thought of it as a prisoner's dilemma, but the moment you have such tangible, localized benefits, the numbers within that matrix change, and suddenly unilateral action starts making a lot more sense. So I think academically that framing from burden to opportunity is becoming a lot more clear with these benefits like cleaner air.
That's a terrific point, Sugandha. And I remember that this narrative, the whole narrative began to change in around 2009 when sort of clean growth and the co-benefits and the move to renewables were not seen as dichotomous, but basically fulfilling the same objective. If I could come to Alexis next, because we've had a question again on, there's a lot of interest in this intersection between action and SDGs, and then the instruments and the tools that are needed to basically catalyze that. And there's a lot of interest around carbon markets, for instance. And we've seen lots of initiatives announced at the COP on carbon markets in developing countries. So I wondered, Alexis, do you want to touch on this intersection between SDGs and climate action at COP? And what have you seen that's been the most significant with regards to, let's say, adaptation finance and SDGs in terms of the politics or the announcements?
Sure. So I think there's kind of a specific water angle there on the adaptation question. I mean, one thing that came out earlier this week on the Water Day was the action on water adaptation and resilience from the COP27 presidency, which is kind of just linking the discussion between climate and water, which has been unfortunately kind of a little bit too separated for too long. There's a lot of discussion both about water and kind of the wash and social inequality issues that are really tied in, especially with the increase of drought or the floods, kind of the changes in the water system that just make it difficult to manage fresh water getting to the people that it needs. So that's one part on the water front. And then on the other, because of COP15 happening in a few weeks in Montreal, there's been a lot of discussion about the intersection between climate and nature, which also, as Cameron mentioned a bit earlier, has been a little bit too separate for too long. So trying to make sure that there's a thread of ambition that comes from COP27 through to COP15. In terms of the other pieces on adaptation, I mean, something that we heard from, there was a People's Plenary today in the hall where we heard from advocates from the Women and Gender Caucus, the Trade Unions Caucus, the Disability Rights Caucus. And one thing that was really highlighted front and center there, which has been really not discussed at all in the adaptation space, is just maladaptation when it comes to disability. And how much, when we're thinking about redesigning our systems for resilience, that we need to keep disabled people in mind. If not, it's just a maladaptation. And there were some stats shared there that disabled people are 4 times more likely to be affected or to die in climate disasters. So just making sure that we're thinking about the intersectional lens of adaptation, not only when it comes to resources, but also when it comes to justice considerations. So yes.
A terrific point, and I like the framing of adaptation and maladaptation there. And today is supposed to be Solutions Day at the COP. So interesting to see all of these messages coming out. To me, it feels like there is a lot happening, but I'm not a veteran like you. So that is really interesting. I'd like to sort of move to Steve next, because we've got a very specific question on the interdependency between nature and climate and the role that nature-based solutions can play in mitigation and adaptation. Has that got sufficient space at COP, and what's needed to drive more capital into nature-based solutions in your view?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I think that probably aren't at the negotiation levels enough of connections between the sort of biodiversity issues and the climate issues we're facing. There's been a lot of discussion over many years in COP about setting up good systems for trying to stop the rates of deforestation we've seen globally and try to support, at least holding that, maybe even increasing and restoring forest areas. But of course, as well as COP27, there's COP15 in Montreal for the biodiversity negotiations. And so there's huge scope for join up. I think work done by colleagues here at Oxford, including Cécile Girardin in the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, shows that nature-based solutions do have an important but limited role to play in stabilizing temperature and holding us to the temperature limits of the Paris Agreement. They definitely shouldn't be seen as a substitute for ramping down the fossil CO2 that we're dumping into the atmosphere. But the two issues are intertwined. I think actually at the scientific level, there have been pretty good links. So alongside the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which works to really provide the scientific evidence that goes into the international climate negotiations, if you ever see a reference in UNFCCC text to best available scientific evidence, that's basically code for what the IPCC says. There's also an equivalent, the IPBES, which works on biodiversity science and data for the biodiversity negotiations. And those teams of scientists have got really well together in the last few years and produced much better evidence on critical issues such as what is the sustainable amount of biomass and resources from the natural world that we can use to mitigate climate change. So actually, these negotiation processes have actually brought together a really good scientific evidence base, I think. What we aren't seeing is that translating into real action and agreements at political level at the moment.
And perhaps the biodiversity COP that's coming up might be one space to watch in terms of what actually gets done. We're sort of getting into the last couple of minutes of the webinar, and what I'd like to do is kind of go to everyone and get sort of their final thoughts with regards to perhaps this COP, and then looking forward, what can we expect that's significant that might happen in the next 12 months to the COP in the UAE. So Cameron, I'm going to come to you last because I'd like you to have the last word. So what I'd like to do is perhaps start off with Sugandha. So Sugandha, can you give us a view perhaps on next year when India is also going to be hosting the G20, which will be at the same time as the COP? What are your sort of final thoughts on this?
Okay, so look, final thoughts. I think in practice, climate policy on the ground is the outcome of a tug of war. And this tug of war involves different interest groups. You have green businesses versus dirty businesses. You have climate conscious citizens versus citizens that are neutral, or those that are actively employed in the legacy industry of fossil fuels. So actually, even though we have these international negotiations, what I'll focus is on the interlude between the COPs, okay? So this COP has just ended. We're going to have a space. And what we can do in this space is actually look at the domestic political economy and reinvigorate and energize the groups that support climate action. So these are the green business interests. We need to bolster and support them. We need to support citizens, awareness, bolster their awareness about climate change issues, because ultimately that's what determines the politicians' incentive to enact stronger climate policy. So I guess, Anupama, to conclude, let's use the space between COPs to energize and the green citizenry and business interests. That will be a kind of communications challenge, as well as kind of giving R&D support to the various green industries. And then in time for the next COP, I think we really need to zoom down on that narrative of co-benefits and win-wins, because there's not enough of that. We need to show a lot of the citizens and countries across the world that you can save by doing this energy transition, as the Smith School project has shown. You can save 12 trillion, households can save energy bills, it can create this deflationary force. So I'll end there.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's more than enough evidence basically and we have to put that out somehow. Alexis, could I come to you next for quick wrap-up comments on this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we saw a really united front coming in with developing countries straight in, getting loss and damage on the agenda, which was huge. And I guess the thing that I take away most from this COP is that there's been an extreme amount of solidarity between movements. We've seen the connection with human rights, a lot of human rights activists really leaning in with climate justice activists to talk about the amount of political prisoners here in Egypt. We've been seeing disability justice advocates talking with indigenous peoples about access and land. Like there's been so much cohesion in the climate justice movement, and it's been a really incredible thing to see, and a lot of energy and power here. I think the key thing that will determine whether or not this COP is a success is the decision on loss and damage, because it is, for me, like the key issue that has really defined this COP. A lot of delegates saying they're not walking away without a financing facility, so we'll see where that goes. But in between now and next COP, it would be interesting to see how we can mobilize adaptation funding and loss and damage funding to where it needs to go, as well as all of the much needed mitigation activity. But it's just been really interesting to see the kind of boiling over of frustration and centuries of inequality that have finally kind of bubbled up into really getting money on the table. So that's, for me, the legacy of this COP.
Absolutely. And it'd be interesting to see what comes out at the very last minute, maybe 4 a.m. on Saturday morning or whatever, with regards to loss and damage. Steve, could I come to you next?
In the next 12 months, we just need to see action, action, action. So the negotiations, the way they're structured, they reward announcements and pledges more than action. And the reserve of action, as Sugandha and Alexis have said, is at national level, at community level, at organizational level. And even though I'm sort of here with my carbon removal hat on, I think we've got to focus. Emissions is the key part of that, right? So the falling cost of renewables is a cause for a little optimism. But I think in this discussion about phasing down fossil fuels, we have to recognize that as well as stimulating the good stuff, we are at the point where we need to pull the bad stuff off the system. So a really startling headline from the recent IPCC report is that existing fossil fuel infrastructure that has already been built, if run for its expected lifetime, is going to emit more than 100 billion tons more CO2 than we have capacity for to stay below 1.5 degrees. If we then bring on all the stuff that's on the planning books, an additional 200 billion tons, we get enough for 2 degrees C already. So we need to be pulling off the dirty as well as bringing on the clean, and that's going to involve either retiring stuff early or maybe connecting some up to carbon capture and storage. So I think that's one of the key bits of action. I mean, just briefly on carbon removal, I do think it would be a major step forward for countries in their nationally determined contributions, their NDCs, to actually set out how much removal they plan to scale up, and to mainstream this idea across sectors, across land management, across industry, across energy, that it is possible to do removals in some of these situations as well as cut emissions. But several things that we can do to scale up removals are actually things that are good for emissions as well. So cleaning up our sources of energy, sorting out, what can we use from the natural world sustainably as part of energy, particularly waste and residues, and where they're going to come from. Building the transport and storage infrastructure to deal with the CO2 waste that we're already emitting and is already in the atmosphere. Those are all things that are wins across emissions reductions and removals.
Thanks, Steve. So I'm going to come to Cameron for the last word. And Cameron, if I may, I might use the chair's prerogative to shape your comments a little bit, but you can choose to ignore that if you wish. So one of the things that we did see at COP was the head of the WTO expressed this desire to try and get a global environmental trade deal sometime in the next year. So having worked on this area a lot, I wondered whether you had any final thoughts on whether you see something like that happening. And as I said, any other wrap-up comments?
Wow, Anupama, that's a tough one, given that we're already over time and there's so much. I mean, obviously, it's great having Ngozi in hard on this area with advice from Dan Esty at Yale, who I caught up with just last week. I think there's an awful lot we can do with the trade regime, not just on border adjustments, although I think that needs to be done more seriously. It's good to see the action that EU and the US as well there, but also on just supporting lower tariffs and trade in clean goods, environmental goods, and that's been stalled negotiations there for a while. But it goes beyond that too. I mean, perhaps in wrapping up, because I know we're over time, let me just highlight it's a kind of a trade, but one of the exciting things to come out of COP26 was the JETP for South Africa, the Just Energy Transition Partnership. We've now got one for Indonesia as well, and there's discussion about a possible one for Vietnam in the coming 12 months. those sorts of partnerships, roughly the order of 10, 20 billion of financing and some small amounts of grants, and then leveraging that to the 100 billion needed to actually finance, to deploy the clean energy and the clean technologies that we need. They're a bright spot, I think. And as they get scaled up, they pull the cost down locally. We've seen the US Inflation Reduction Act. It's huge in scale. It's going to pull the cost down further. I mean, this is where the high points are to be found. Going back to something we were discussing earlier, if everybody actually delivers on what they say they were going to deliver, we're on track. It's another space for optimism. And let me finish on Alexis's point, which is that this has been a COP about loss and damage. The claims for loss and damage will only get louder and more legitimate and more ferocious the longer we fail on the mitigation side of things. So we just need, going back to what Steve said, it's all about action at this point. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Cameron. So with that, and with apologies for overshooting on time, but I think that reflects how much there is to talk about, we've come to the end of this COP27 roundup, and it's been a fascinating discussion. So thank you very much to all our brilliant speakers. Thanks to most of our attendees for staying with us till the end. And please check out our website, smithschool.ox.ac.uk, where you can find information on all of our events. Sign up for them, and please download and look at our publications, which cover a lot of what we've discussed today. So thanks very much, and goodbye, everyone. Thank you.